What's up, everyone? And welcome to Super Brain Radio. In the first episode, I kind of needed to start with the immune system, even though it was slightly awkward because of how complicated the immune system really is. But the point was to drive home the importance of the data and the fact that it's never the data's fault. And that's really all I would love for you guys to take home from that first episode, because the immune system will make more sense later on. But for the time being, just assume that whoever it is that's always listening is the immune system. And that gives us the opportunity to look at stress differently. And that was really my point in setting up this episode. Now, it's funny, when I look back, there was a time where I was traveling quite often to do seminars. And when I would get to the biological portion of strength sports and strength dynamics in general, I would always start with the fact that we are stress based creatures. And it even triggers a totally analogous but more recent memory of when I was on the Mark Bell podcast. They asked me, "What is happiness?" And I see a similarity in those two scenarios in that it's responsibility and your ability to traverse a lot of obstacles successfully that is kind of the answer to those, When we look at what is your ability to be happy, has a lot to do with your self-worth. And if we look at even more in depth, well, what's that? Like, what's your self-value? What do you see in yourself? It's partly being reaffirmed by those around you, but it's also partly knowing that in a way they kind of need you because of what you provide and do for them. It's something that spans far greater than just thinking about stress as this negatively connotated word that only occurs when you're just vaguely upset or whatever it is that's negative. That's not, in fact, true. Especially in America, we know how bad it is to be sedentary, and we know how dangerous it is to expose yourself to nothing, let alone bad things. We're all fully aware of how easy it is for bad habits to pop up and how hard it is for them to disappear sometimes. No matter how much you may want to, there's always some type of semi methodical foot that you need to put forward after another to get that bad habit to go away. The same way, if you want to learn a good habit, it's certainly not a 1 + 1 = equation. And that, again, relates back to stress. So, my point today is again to drive a perspective shift in how you view something, but more importantly, to break it down so we can see and think about the word stress differently if we know more in depth about the composition of what it means. So I want to break stress down into three categories and kind of make the analogy of being taxed because it makes a lot of sense. So kind of going back to us being stress-based creatures, every system in our body has a way of responding differently to stress. Again, thanks to the immune system, but for example, there are several different ways our muscles we can adapt, and we know that because all the different sports there are in the world and all the different ways a certain style of training can make you look and feel and perform. The same way you pick different clothes is how your inherent ability to respond to stress is. Some people are better or worse at certain capacities in exercise or certain tolerances when it comes to disease and even vitamins and mineral needs. So it's easiest to break it down into categories first. Let's start with survival tax. And this is one that we cannot dissociate from. For example, our brain is going to take roughly 20% of your energy that you take in through your mouth via food. We call it calories, we call it whatever you want when it comes to how you measure your food intake. Even if you just measure it in how hungry you are, your brain's just automatically taking 20% of that. Now, that's going to vary based on a lot of things. Like, for example, what if you didn't eat very much today? That alone can attribute to brain fog. But what if you ate less and your energy levels increased? What does then that say about your energy demands? Well, we're not going to get into that. There'll be a section on nutrition, but that just kind of alludes to the fact that there's something deeper and more inherent to what it means to just be alive. So, for example, and this is a large bandwidth, you only really need 50 milligrams of leucine, one of the most specific amino acids we can talk about when it comes to protein synthesis. You only need about 50 milligrams of that to truly survive, which is roughly something you can get from anywhere. Even a piece of fruit that isn't necessarily yielding any protein will likely have something close to 50 milligrams of leucine in there somewhere. But that's just to survive. That doesn't mean to get out of bed and do things. And there's a cost associated with that. Whether you are 250 pounds and you're very calm, cool, and collected, or you're 120 pounds and you may be a little bit of a psychopath when it comes to energy levels, there's still a something that you have to pay off just to be you. Ideally, you want to pay this off with what I call PBO work, which means parasympathetic beta oxidation. Overall, you don't need to really know what that means, but just associate PBO with how you live the majority of your passive life. What that means is your heart rate should be low, your respiration should be in rhythm, like a cadence that's calm and doesn't break too often. And more importantly, things like your temperature, your appetite, your ability to do things if needed, or your ability to relax should all be in kind of this beautiful symbiosis. The cost of adaptation is what really makes us human. It's funny because what I talk about after has to do with consciousness, but the cost of adaptation is really what makes the human being the top of the food chain right now. So, this is something that is a little more of a long, low, and slow process, whereas survival tax is always pretty much the same. Yeah, sure, it'll change every couple decades or whatever, but the cost of adaptation is far more individual and much more of a compounding effect. And this is going back to those bad habits I talked about, or maybe some of the good habits. So, if you decide your new goal is to lose weight, and you start trying to lose weight for 12 weeks, and halfway there, you realize you want to change your goal. Although that's perfectly fine, now pivoting may or may not have some lag time. There may or may not be transfer to and from what you just did. And more importantly, that change is going to have a cost. Starting something new almost always has the highest cost. Then we see cost go down when we talk about getting better, becoming an intermediate, all of that stuff. And then we see cost go up again as you become a master. Now, that term cost alone can be broken down into many different things. We have, for example, the cost of learning in the sense of what happens when you get exposed to something new or try to get better at something. The neurons in your head associated with it get red hot. You can't be constantly using something that's red hot. You got to cool it down. And after you cool it down, you need to let it rest, and only then can you get it red hot again. And that happening again and again and again and causing change is certainly not free. Or how about maybe you want to be more sophisticated at something? You want to refine something, become more efficient at something. You now need to learn how to differentiate between right and wrong, have a greater composition of success to failures when you participate. And that is a whole different section of your brain that is not free to use. This certainly extends to muscle building and any other goal you can really think about in your lifestyle. When it comes to getting better at something, there's a cost. We don't want to talk about getting worse, but it's certainly not free, and that can kind of all go back to the American sedentary problem. There's a cost to that adaptation as well. It's essentially that our brain is always looking for something to respond to, and if there's no stimuli, you can bet that the brain will certainly find something to respond to. We can really talk about anxiety being something like that. When there's a mismanagement between what needs to be done and what we're capable of doing, got stuck there, but you get the point, right? When there's this discrepancy between what's capable and what's possible, we can't really manage that super well because we have no ability to predict the future. We have no brain center for the future. If that makes sense, then you realize why anxiety is possible because we have this leftover energy and we can't apply it to planning. So you need to find something else in your acute day or field to occupy that. Lastly, we have what I call reality tax. Now, this is funny because we all know that you'll never live the same day twice. Although the actual variances may be small, they still exist. So, for example, if you're trying to do a workout in the summer versus the winter and you live in a climate that has all four seasons, that's different. If you're trying to lose a little bit of weight, but you're going through the hardest period of time in life, versus the easiest and most successful period of time in life, there's a difference there. Furthermore, little things like dropping your cup of coffee the morning of a big meeting or just feeling absolutely amazing for seemingly no reason sometimes. All these little tiny things really, really matter. It even extends to memory. If you want to remember something promptly, now, that takes a very specific cognitive setup, meaning some areas of your brain ideally need to be dormant or very relaxed, while others need to be firing electrically, and even more difficult, need to be in the same electrical cadence as other areas to coordinate something. Whether it be speech or chest or catching a football, there's a different type of coordination that needs to be essentially spot on to happen. Now, that reality portion does come from consciousness, meaning the day that happens in front of you is going to happen unexpectedly, going back to that lack of future. But more importantly, there's a cost to vigilance, which means that as the day ensues, you need to be prepared, and your body has hormonal structures set up for that. That's what our cortisol systems do, that's what our adrenal systems do, and all that. So, if we wanted to spend a longer time on this, we could talk about how there's organs, there's metabolisms, there's entire sections of our body that are associated with each of these three sections. And that's why I feel it's an excellent breakdown of stress. And again, the overarching point was that we're trying to change the connotation and take control over the stress that you expose yourself to and choose to get better at. It's not that you should avoid it, it's kind of a use it or lose it phenomenon. If you want to be the best self, if you want to get something that you haven't had before, then you need to expose yourself to something that you necessarily haven't done before and recognize and accept that it'll probably be perceived as difficult, but you ultimately want it. And it's not a negative difficult, it's a cost. I hope that's enjoyable, guys. We'll talk next week.